Yo, what's going on? It's your boy JGoo with another episode of Mathlab. I currently got some requests on more factoring videos. The question that I was asked was to do more examples with trinomials. So we didn't really do trinomials, we did polynomials, which is just 1x. It never really went up to the x squared term. Which is generally where there's more factoring involved, so I can see why this question was brought about. And they wanted me to do examples in which our ax squared term was not equal to 1. So it calls for a little bit of simplifying, a little bit of factoring, just a combination of the first two videos that I put out. So we're going to do those now. Okay, so the general form for trinomials is here. Okay, so it's ax squared bx plus c. Okay, so it's a squared term. There's an x, and then the c just represents a constant. Okay, so in our example, we have 4x squared plus 12x plus 5, and that's, you can see that our a is 4, our b is 12, and our c is 5. Right? Okay, so generally when people factor, there's a whole bunch of different tricks, but the one I learned, we'll call it the X game. With the X game, which is how I learned how to factor, draw a big X, alright, and you take your A term and your C term and you multiply them. Okay, so in our case, it'll be 5 times 4, which will be 20. Okay, and then you drop your B term at the bottom of the X, which would just be 12. So A times C, we put at the top of the X. The B term, which is 12, we put at the bottom of the X. Okay? Okay, now what we want to see is we want to find two numbers that multiply to get 20 and add to get 12. Now these numbers can be positive or negative, it doesn't matter. Okay? So let's think about this. What two numbers multiply to get 20? The first thing that comes to my head is 10 and 2. Right? That's the simplest thing. It's an even number, therefore you know it's divisible by 2. 10 times 2 is 20. Okay? It just so happens that that works out in this case because 10 times 2 is 20, and 10 plus 2 is 12, which is exactly what we need. In the middle of our x, imagine there being a plus sign in the middle of the x. So these numbers have to add to get your b term, and they have to multiply to get your c times a term, which is 20, from the 5 times the 4. Right? So we have our two factors. We have 10, and we have 2. 10 times 2 is 20, 10 plus 2 is 12. So those are our two factors. Okay? So when we come over here and we're breaking, what we're doing is we're decomposing this trinomial into two polynomials. Okay? That when you multiply out, they get you this exact trinomial. Okay? I know it's a lot of verbiage, but I want to repeat it so you understand and you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so when we come over here, we have our factors, 10 and 2. We take, since our a term is not 1, we have to bring the 4 down, like this. So it would be 4x, this is a positive 10, plus 10, and then we have 4x plus 2. So when we FOIL this out, we will get 4x squared plus 12x plus 5. Okay? Alright, so these two are factors of this. Now this can be reduced. Okay, all of these numbers are even. Okay, when your a term is not 1, you could either reduce and then you solve for x. Okay, most of the time when it's 1, you just have to subtract this number from both sides of the equal sign, because we're going to end up setting both of these equal to 0 to find your x. Okay? Sometimes some teachers may ask you to just factor it and not solve for x, but you can leave it in this term, but you still need to simplify, which is easy because they're easy, they're even numbers, right? So all we have to do is divide this whole thing by 2, okay? So from here, we divide everything by 2, we get 2x plus 5, and we get 2x plus 1. This is the factored form of this equation, okay? Now if your teacher asked you to solve for x, well then, anytime you have in your question solve for, that means it's an inequality. That means you have to add an equal sign and 0, okay? Equal sign and 0. Anytime you're solving for something, you want to isolate your variable. You want your variable to be on one side and all the numbers without a letter on the other side of the equal sign. And whatever you do to one side of the equal sign, you have to do it to the other. Simple, okay? So, if we wanted to solve for x, it would be, and you're going to have 2 solutions. And the reason why you have two solutions is because this is a quadratic, right? A quadratic equation looks like that. It's a parabola. So it's going to hit the x-axis at 2 points, which is why you're going to have 2 solutions at all times when you factor trinomials. Okay, so solving for your x, you get 2x equals negative 5, divide by 2, you get x equals negative 5 halves, and then solving for the other side, we get 2x equals negative 1, divide by 2, to get the x by itself, we get x equals 1 half. So this parabola will hit the x-axis at negative 1 half and negative 5 halves. Okay? And that's it. This is the factored form, the reduced factored form, and this is what x equals. Okay? Now had this been a 1, all of these coefficients to our x term when we factored would have went away. And I'll show you on the next example. Okay, I'm glad you guys got a second to absorb and understand all this information. I kind of started with the harder problem because the request was having this a term, this ax squared term, equal to a number other than 1. And when it's 1, it makes life a lot easier because you don't have to simplify, you don't have to reduce, and solving for x overall is just a lot easier. You generally don't deal with fractions. It's just a lot easier when this is equal to 1. But in the last example, it was equal to 4, which still wasn't too hard. It was just 2 extra steps that we needed to do to simplify it. Okay, now I'll show you the difference and how much easier it is when this a term is 1. And generally, when you first look at a problem like this, you want to ask yourself, is this problem already reduced? Because if it's not reduced, chances are you can get it down to where this a term is 1 anyway, and it'll be a lot easier for you. Okay, so in this example, our a term is 1, right? There is no number in front of x squared, which implies that it's 1, okay? There's only one x squared, okay? And so let's do it again. Our factoring method, like we did in the last problem, is going to be the x game. Now, there's a lot of different ways, but this is the way I do it, okay? We're going to draw our x, okay? We're going to multiply our c term times our a term, and it goes at the top of the x, okay? Remember that. So 8 times 1 is 8 at the top of the x. And then whatever our b term is, right? The b term is always with the regular x, not the x squared, okay? Is 6. We're going to put that at the bottom of the x, of the big X. It's a lot of x's, I know. Alright, so remember, we want our two numbers to multiply to get the top number and to add and get the bottom number. That's the trick, that's the puzzle, that's what you have to find. Luckily, these are simple numbers, Okay, if you want to, you can put a plus or a little asterisk in the middle of the x to let you know that you have to multiply for the top and add for the bottom. Okay, so in this case, it's easy. 4 times 2 is 8. Sorry, 4 times 2 is 8, and 4 plus 2 is 6. Easy. So we come over here. There is no number in front of our x squared. Or in other words, our a is equal to 1. So therefore, we bring down an x plus 4. And the reason why this is x and not x squared is because when you multiply it, we have x plus 4 and x plus 2, right? When you multiply this out, this x times this x, which is called the FOIL method, multiplying this times this is FOIL, right? First, outer, inner, last. So our first terms, right? Our outer terms, our inner terms, and our last terms. Well, when you multiply our first terms, x times x will get you this x squared. Okay, so after you do the x game, it's always going to be x. It's never going to be an x squared right here. Okay, not unless you start with a cube in this spot. Then when you factor, it'll go down an exponent of x. Or in other words, it will go down to x squared when you factor it. Don't get too hung up on that. Just know that when it's in this form and you factor using the x game, after you find your two factors, this will always be an x. This will never be an x squared. Okay? Because when you, like I said, when you multiply it all out, you should get this equation. X times x is going to get you this x squared. And maybe I should FOIL it at the end so you can see that this is the right answer. It is a good way to check yourself. Okay, so we have x plus 4 and x plus 2. And there is no simplification or reducing because this is a 1 and this is a, we can't divide by 2, because this is a 1 in front of the x. So there's no common factor, so this is the reduced form of this equation. This is the factor form. And just like in the other problem, if you want to solve for x, well, it's easy now. X equals -4, x equals -2. And I just did that so fast because if you set both of these equations, right, equal to 0, all you have to do is move the 2 over. If it's a positive 2, you're moving it on the other side of the equal sign, so now it's a -2, right? Because you would have to subtract it on this side to get rid of it, and then subtract it on the other side of the equal sign, right? Because whatever you do on one side, you do on the other. So that's how I got it so fast. So from here, you can see x equals -4, x equals -2, and that's where it hits the x-axis. That's where our parabola hits the x-axis. So it's not hard. Okay, so let me show you guys how we can check and double check to make sure that this is the right factored form of this equation. It's called the FOIL method. Now we learned a lot today, right? Alright, so the FOIL method, what was our factors? X plus 4, or maybe I should erase all of this. So remember this equation, x squared plus 6x plus 8. Alright. Okay, so those are the factors we came up with, right? So now let's do this FOIL method. Let me write this here. FOIL, right? Like tin foil, like aluminum foil. It's an acronym. It stands for first, outer, inner, last. Please don't make me write that down. I'm limited on board space. So first, outer, inner, last. Okay? So and it's talking about multiplying. So we have two terms, right? We multiply the first terms first. So the first terms. So the first term in this parentheses is x. The first term in this parentheses is x. So x times x is x squared. Right? Then our outer terms. Outer being the outermost on both of these. So x and 2. Those are our outer terms. Right? The very far left is an x. The very far right is a 2. So 2 times x Easy, 2x. Plus 2x. Now our inner terms. So the things in the middle, the things bunched up in the middle are 4 and another x, right? So 4 times x is 4x. And lastly, our last terms. So the last one from this one is 4, and the last from this one, or this set of parentheses, is 2. So 4 times 2 is 8. And when we simplify this, we get x squared plus, what's 2x plus 4x? They're common. They both have an x. They're common terms. They're like terms. Remember that? Like terms. They both have one x. So we have to add them. We can simplify those by adding them together. So we get 6x plus 8, which is exactly what we started with. So therefore, this is correct for our factor. And that method of checking yourself and multiplying out is called FOIL. You multiply the first terms, our outer terms, our inner terms, and our last terms. And you'll come up with this, right? X squared plus 2x plus 4x plus 8. You add the 4x and the 2x because they're like terms, and you end up with exactly what we started with. Okay? And that is how you factor trinomials when the ax, right, is equal to 1. It's a lot easier. Okay, and our last example for today is going to be another trinomial, of course, where the a term is not equal to 1. And I just erased the formula and the format and the equation. I erased all that stuff because hopefully it's embedded in your head now. If not, just rewind it. Beauty of YouTube, right? Okay, so our a term here is 6. Our b term here is 19. And our c term is 7. So what do we do when we want to factor? Right? We do use the x game. Okay? Remember? So here we are. The x. The big X. Okay? What goes at the top of our x? It's our c term times our a term. In this case, it will be 7 times 6. Right? Which will be 42. Alright, now in this one, our signs aren't all positive, so you have to keep up with that. So we have a negative 7 times a positive 6, which is negative 42. Okay? And in the middle, we have negative 19. I'll put that at the bottom of our x. Okay? Now, the factors may be a little harder to find, but it still shouldn't be that hard. Okay, so what I always do when I start, this is an even number, so I just go ahead and see if whatever factor I'm looking for involves a 2. So half of 42 is 21, right? 21 times 2. Well, that looks like it's going to work. We have to adjust our signs a little bit, right? But 21 times 2 is 42, and 21 minus 2 is 19. Okay? Now, we don't have our signs. It's not a negative 19 and it's not a negative 42, but it gets us our factors, so we just have to tweak our signs just a little bit. So, in order for two numbers to multiply and be a negative, they both can't be negative, right? Because a negative times a negative is a positive. So one of these terms has to be a negative. Well, let's see. If we want a negative 19, and we know that in the middle of this x is a plus sign, right? Because these two terms have to add to get to negative 19, then I'm going to make my negative number the 21. I'm going to make 21 a negative, because negative 21 plus 2 gives me negative 19. And negative 21 times 2 gives me negative 42. And that's our factors. Okay? The hardest part is done. Finding those two numbers is the hardest part of factoring, which is why I use the x game, because you can see it. Imagine trying to find these numbers in your head. Right? It'd just be too much going on. So write it down. Use the x game. Okay? So we have a number in front of our, for our a term, right? We have a number in front of our x squared, which is our a term. So therefore we have to drop that number. 6x minus 21 and 6x plus 2. Now, generally, and like in our first example, when we have a number for our other than 1 for our a or our x squared term, then we have to reduce or simplify further when we get our two factors. And we do, because we can see that this term is divisible by 6, so it can be reduced by 6, and this term can be reduced by 2. So let's do that. So if we reduce this by 6, we'll get x minus, or I'm sorry, that's not divisible by 2. It's divisible by 3. I mean, it's not divisible by 6. It's divisible by 3. Because 6 or 21 is not divisible by 6. I'm sorry. So this whole equation, if we wanted to reduce it, we have to find the greatest common factor, which would be 3. Not 2, because this is odd, but 3. So if we divide this, just this, by the number 3, we will get 2x minus 7. Okay? And then if we divide this by 2, because they're both even, we will get 3x plus 1. So these are our factors. This is our factored form for this. Okay? So if the question asks, factor this trinomial, this will be your answer. If the question asks, factor and solve for x, well, you just have to take it a step further and find, remember, this is where your parabola hits the x-axis. So all you have to do is get your x's on one side and solve for x, you know? So we will set both of these different sets of parentheses equal to 0, because they're two different roots. They're two different points in which that graph hits the x-axis. So first we start by setting 2x minus 7 to 0. Well, if we add 7 to both sides, it will be 2x equals positive 7. And then afterwards, to get the x by itself, we will have to divide by 2. So in short, we will get x equals 7 divided by 2 for one root. And here, we would get x equals negative 1/3. How did I get that? This is equal to 0, right? We subtract the 1 to get the x by itself. So it'll be 3x equals negative 1. And then to get the x by itself, to get the number from in front of the x, right, we have to divide it. We have to divide that 3 to split it up, to split the x and the 3 up. So if we divide by 3, we have to do it on both sides. So this would cancel, and it would be 1/3 on the other side. So the two roots are 7/2 and negative 1/3. And that's if you had to solve for x. Okay, I hope these videos help. And you, my friend, have just factored trinomials.